Hi, welcome to the podcast, Hardship with Ease, with your host, me, Jamila. So excited to be able to do this. So, the topic today is vulnerability. And when I think about vulnerability as a topic, it's like really interesting because I never fully believed in being vulnerable, realistically. I felt like sharing yourself gave people ammunition, like you just are putting yourself in a vulnerable place. And so I kind of like pent up a lot of myself. And at the same time, I really craved being connected with other people when I was younger. So those two mindsets kind of bounced back and forth. So, to really introduce this podcast, as our first episode is on vulnerability, this podcast, once again, is called Hardship with Ease with me, Jamila, and it's kind of a direct response to all the crazy shit that's happened in my life. Like, this year has been so hard to deal with. So, I took, the Aya, with every hardship comes ease. And I really have tried to put that within my life. And so that's where the title of this podcast comes from. And please listen to the introduction to the podcast if you want to know a little bit more about all the symbolism I put into this. But I really just want to start with saying that I struggled a lot during this hard time to find a place that really took my perspective of being Somali, Muslim, a middle child, just so many different things. I've constantly had different conversations with friends, listened to different podcasts, even read self-help books. And I constantly got different answers and different things that I learned from each place, but I didn't really have a place or found a place that kind of took all of those lessons I learned and put it into one place. So that's where this podcast comes out of. So I will talk about things within my hardship as well as trying to explore some of those places that I learned from. I'm constantly trying to balance this collective mindset that I have as well as my individual mindset. So we are going to discuss a lot of things that I'm facing, bring in some research from the Western perspective as well as some research that I've done on the Islamic perspective and African perspective, and also try to introduce stories from my community and just not hear from just me yapping all day. And excited to do this. So I talked about vulnerability as being today's topic, and my bold statement of the day about vulnerability is that vulnerability is a privilege. Now, I will constantly talk about all the isms, classism, racism, sexism all the time, including in this podcast. And I just want to acknowledge that although these things do happen, we are individuals and our individual lives and decisions kind of build us who we are. But y'all do have to realize you didn't fall off of the coconut tree, just like Kamala said. I usually hate when people bring up their upbringings and try to like tie it into why they function in the world, but I know I'm gonna do it a lot, so I might as like kind of acknowledge this, especially thinking about vulnerability and how it stems from like my religious upbringing, my identity in the world around me. And so that's kind of the reason why it started with vulnerability as my first topic. Yeah, so to like have this podcast, I'm going to have to be vulnerable in order to actually address some of the topics I want to cover. So that's why I put my real name on this, which I hate putting my real name on things because I don't want anything ever to be connected to me. But, I'm going to have to be for real. So, first off, when we're thinking about vulnerability, I kind of tend to be like, what's the definition in the dictionary? What does the word actually mean? So, I hated the word vulnerabilities because I always think about the actual definition from the Oxford Dictionary, which is like the quality or state of being exposed to the possible attack or harm either physically or emotionally. And I was like, what's wrong with y'all? Why are we using like this word vulnerable to represent like being true to yourself and like loving? And I'm like, girl, I'm thinking like animals gonna attack me or something. So I really kept thinking about that. And as I first do when starting this podcast now is research, because I went to school for research and I love researching. So when I looked up like this term vulnerability, I was so interested to see like when I was doing for real research, it was like talking about social vulnerabilities, disenfranchisement, and all of those things. And I was really interested to see like how in self-help books we say like vulnerable, and I'm not seeing that in the actual research, even when I throw in like psychology terms to try to find something. So I did find interesting research, but technically not directly on the word vulnerability. So, outside of like the nerdy research, something I came to realization as writing this was that when you don't fit into like the nuclear family, or you are a person of color, or you're non-conforming, you are vulnerable all the time to criticism, attack, just being out there and perceived as different constantly, whether you like it or not. Yeah, so aside from going through like a traumatic event or like a huge changing part of your life, every day has vulnerabilities. And so I know for myself, before I went through like my hardship, which is the broad term I'll use as I go through these episodes, I'll talk a bit more about the different elements of it. But yeah, I struggled with like this forced vulnerability through my life, even before having like hardship or, things happening to me. And so I think I really developed a coping mechanism that I speak a certain way. You can hear in this podcast, right? I present myself well so I don't have to deal with like anything, you know? And I really wanted to be like valued based on the way I acted and like looked. So yeah, like, girl, I really did it and it was so tiring. And like, I created these things, I think, looking back, as a way to keep me safe from actually having to address like any type of vulnerability. It was like, bro, I don't want to be vulnerable, period. Right? So I was the only hijabi when I was in school, outside of like my sister, who didn't go to school all the time with me because she was a year younger. And so I also started wearing hijab at 8, which was my choice, strong choice at that, but it was definitely a me choice. And so I really kind of bring this up because I kind of started going at a young age, creating like this persona of myself. And so when I started going through like hard times, hardship, I felt like it was hard to acknowledge those hard times to people around me, because like the relationships I built were based on the like public persona, and I felt like I couldn't be vulnerable with the people around me, even if like they would care, they would mean well. I was like, girl, I'm gonna keep it quiet because it was just very hard for me. And so even like the way I'm talking now, like, I don't know if you could tell, but I have like 10 different accents mixed into each other. Like, yes, I can sound like Atlanta, I can do da da da, but like, I know certain ways I speak is like based out of a coping mechanism to not be like judged. And I bring this up because like, I think the first point of research I want to point out, very old, very great, from W.E. Du Bois, that talked about double consciousness. And so like, there's a version that you know of yourself, and then there's a version that other people, specifically white people, but other people view you as. And you can think about this towards code switching, but this concept is a very old concept, like 100 years old. And so when I think about my own vulnerability, specifically like in public, I think about like that double consciousness. Like, I did not feel comfortable being vulnerable. Like, I'm already being judged by the way I look, wearing the hijab, being racially ambiguous. I was like, I'm facing all these discriminations and I'd rather not just be vulnerable in life to the wrong people, because I'm already like, you're already looking for a problem with me. And so, and you might say like, oh, the people should accept you for who you are, da da da. But I would really argue like, you don't know, especially at a young age, what people are actually your friends sometimes. You don't know how to function in certain spaces. And so like, you just want to be part of a group. Like, you don't want problems at all. At least me, I didn't want problems. So like, example of this is really thinking about like the whole angry black woman stereotype, and how like this label, when a black woman gets it, is so harmful. And I've watched like friends go through these horrible times because like, they get that label and it's done for them. Like, they not even being aggressive, they're not doing nothing wrong, but it's hard to like fight that vulnerability that they now have because people are like holding on to it. So, and I will say like, also many identities. So like, whether it's being Muslim, being black, specifically like East African at that and not looking like the stereotypical Black woman, I know that my identity is not going to be accepted in every single group that I'm in. Like, I know that certain people, like, your identity when it's very mixed is hard. I don't want to pull the I'm mixed, so I have to choose white or black like card because I'm not even mixed, but you're not sometimes accepted in every single space. And so, in fact, during my research, I found an article and it's called I Just Want to Be My Authentic Self. And then it has like some long scientific name after that, but we're just gonna stick with authentic self. And so they interviewed college students. They're like, college students of color specifically, and they're like, so your identity shifts, like how many of them are there? They kind of identified 6 of them, and then they identified the motivations for those shifts. And so I want to focus on the motivations of those shifting things. So there's 2 types of motivations, right, to shift. And the shifts are things like shifting your behavior, shifting the foods you eat. And so the 2 ways people of color shift are either to, 1, avoid discrimination and other risk factors, or a shift to obtain a reward like inclusion, right? And so when I think about my life, I have to give the background that like I grew up in a Black community. So all the way up to like around grad school, I went to predominantly Black schools, even in college, even though it wasn't HBCU. And I was really blessed. Like, I feel like even though I'm not perceived as Black 9 times out of 10, like I didn't feel like I had to fully do this type of like shift for inclusion. Like, within the past 3 years, I think I've had to do like a strong shift, and that's why I talk like this now and have like this way of speaking, because I've been like so much in this like white shift mode. And I never was really afraid of being vulnerable, right? Like when it came to wearing the hijab. So like adults around me when I was younger would ask me to explain things, and like it was my job as a 10-year-old to explain Islam to you. And honestly, like most of the time it was adults of color, and they're like really chill about it. So like they accepted whatever I said and they were chill. And I think that really allowed me to like appreciate vulnerability in the way that self-help books talk about, and we'll talk a little bit more about how they do that. Because even though I was constantly seen as different, I never felt different. I never felt like I was being discriminated against or feel that my vulnerability put me at risk. Thinking about like that motivation concept, I wasn't motivated by fear at all. So I really had the ability to like stand up for myself and not really face any true repercussion. And of course there's instances that it's a bit different, but I also felt like I had a community. Like if I had an adult come to me crazy, especially like substitutes, I would have classmates like stand up for me and be like, nah, you can't talk to her that way, all of those things. And I felt like that vulnerability that was kind of built into me since the day I wore hijab at a very young age, I didn't really have to address like this vulnerability that people mean to talk about, like long-term vulnerability, especially self-help books. Like even within the Somali community, I generally did not care if I fit in with like the social norms of kids my age, because I felt like, bro, I stood 10 toes down to deal with multiple things in my life. So I didn't feel like I had to do things. Like I was ready to, like if you ask me to present, if you're like, oh, they made my food wrong, I'm ready to jump up and be like, girl, you put potatoes in here when she didn't ask for it. Like I was ready to stand up against discrimination as well, because I didn't feel like I was discriminated against or like I didn't feel small. I felt empowered throughout my life. And so thinking about like self-help books, right? So one book, which was like highly recommended, I'm gonna say that I did not fully read it. I read a bunch of summaries from different sources about it just because I wasn't gonna read that book realistically. And so it's called like Vulnerability is Daring to Be Vulnerable. And it talked about vulnerability, like what people thought vulnerability was, and it really hit on those nails of like not being afraid to ask for help, or not being afraid to say no to someone, or like being loud in a presentation. And these are things I constantly did in my life, right? And I didn't feel like I was struggling with vulnerability, even though I do, because I think it really ties back to that research article. So you remember I talked about like the six shifts that people have. And so they gave examples of those, like behavior, food, like I said before. And so the two positive and negative ways of looking at it is hiding your cultural differences, right? Or trying to persevere and not be that stereotype. So think about hiding your food because you don't want people to think that your culture makes stinky food, especially if you're from a culture that's constantly made fun of about those things. Or like being scared of being called an African booty scratcher. Because, girl, being in school during the era of people calling you an African booty scratcher was so hard. And so a lot of times when I talk to like older millennials, they really like tied into that I gotta hide my culture or I got to be like better than my culture. It was like this shame aspect. And if you go through any coming of age story from like the early 2000s that had to deal with like youth of color, because you know they're the first gen, like they're the first like biggest round of young people who weren't white, and like they constantly were like, I gotta prove myself, I'm not a stinky, like, you know, it's like the Mindy the Mindy effect of life. And so yeah, when I talk to my millennial friends, like older ones especially, like they really tie their identity to, at the time when they're younger, to shamefully hide it or like overcome it like it was an obstacle. Yet when I talk to my Gen Z friends, especially my younger Gen Z friends or cousins, they don't really care about like their cultural identity in that way that that research article was looking at. In fact, they kind of look at it like super positively. So like when you think about like, oh, like I said, a black student speaking more elegantly or working harder to show off their classmates, they didn't think like that. It's like, if I speak good, I speak good. If I speak bad, I speak bad. It's none of your business. And I feel like when I was younger, we really, really had that like first switch of like, I gotta speak better, I gotta speak good. And then it kind of switched a little bit later on in my life. And looking at like all of the things around me now, like people listen to Afro beats, you know, shout out to Rema. People watch K dramas. People know what Ramadan is, right? People love curry. And I know all of those things are examples of culture items and culture, pop culture kind of taking those things. So that doesn't mean racism doesn't exist anymore. It's just that it's more socially acceptable to have culture put into your life. So my point is, bringing this back to vulnerability, is I said vulnerability is a privilege to me because the way that self-help books talk about vulnerability is very simplistic. It's this whole idea of just putting yourself out there and you'll learn to grow from being vulnerable. But raising your hand, stepping up to injustice, those things are privileged things that you do. And so when you are a person of color or someone that's being put in a place of vulnerability, not by choice or forced vulnerability, as I want to call it, you tend to not actually face the things that you go through. You have a lot of fear when it comes to being vulnerable. So thinking about like those millennials and being so scared of sharing their culture, when you look at like younger Gen Z and Alpha, they share their culture. It's not a burden for them at all. And I say that as someone who's early Gen Z, so I feel like I had a mix of both. And the world is becoming a lot more open to those things. And to me, I felt like thinking about that false vulnerability, you didn't have the choice to actually choose to be vulnerable or not. So when thinking about like your culture background or your identity, you didn't feel that vulnerability that you did with it because you were so scared and forced constantly to be vulnerable. So I think that's where this idea of I'm constantly out of my comfort zone, I'm not comfortable, so I'm very comfortable with being uncomfortable and stepping up, right? And so this vulnerability wasn't a conscious choice. And I really think sometimes when things happen in your life that you don't make the choice to do it, that it's just your situation making you make that choice, it sometimes doesn't help you because you're not actually doing it because you learned that lesson. So that's why you see sometimes for me, like, I know people who, as soon as like they grow up in a very religious household, they get out or go to school, they like wild out because they never got the actual choice to make those decisions for themselves. And I think it's the same thing for vulnerability. If I'm constantly vulnerable by force, I'm never going to really try to push that vulnerability by myself, especially when it comes to things a little bit deeper. And I also just want to take a pause here and say, if you are not a person of color, or some of the examples I'm bringing up, you're like, I went through that, but I'm not X, Y, and Z. Like, I think it's just kind of a broad statement that I'm bringing up, and I'm just using being a person of color, honestly, being Black, being Muslim, specifically for myself, as an example of how you can go through these things. So I feel like that was a very heavy introduction to like the thought process and research I kind of came to when thinking about like forced vulnerability versus actual vulnerability. And so now I kind of want to talk about like my own personal journey with vulnerability and where I am now. So of course, we got to start in childhood, like every good story. So when I was younger, like I said, I don't want to be vulnerable because I was constantly vulnerable from that forced vulnerability. So when I first started going through my first round of hardships earlier this year, late last year, I felt very lost, and like vulnerability was a huge thing for me. I think you feel personally when you have a lot of control over your life, especially for me, I've always strived to be like a perfect person. It's really hard for something out of your control, or something that like you make a pillar of, this is why I'm a great person, fall out. And so you start to be a bit confused, at least I was. So I started reading self-help books. And honestly, I was really frustrated because I felt like all of these books and the way they talked about vulnerability, or how society and pop culture talks about vulnerability, is really why I'm kind of the person I am today, or the person I was, with this whole like perfectionism idea, because I already did those so-called vulnerable things in life, not by choice. And they don't talk about the choice aspect of like vulnerability, I believe. And so because I was being vulnerable in these forced places, I felt like I was really hesitant in general to be vulnerable about anything in my life outside of what I was already forced to be when it came to vulnerability. And I hated the word vulnerability, but like I was okay with being in uncomfortable situations and being vulnerable. And I personally never knew how to feel like completely safe and comfortable in public sometimes, and with people outside of my family specifically. I felt like I kind of drew this big imaginary boundary between me and any other person because of just rules I made in my head, kind of like that avoidant attachment style. Like, oh, it's because you're not Muslim. Oh, it's because you're not Somali. Oh, it's because you don't do this. And so I constantly act as if like you won't understand my vulnerabilities because of XYZ. And if I was to open up to that person, I would be at risk of being othered or ostracized. And I feel like I am who I am, and I don't want to be hurt in that way. So I was cool with having friends at school and not really like talking to them about like deep shit, and like not trying to cultivate long-term friendships. I also will say like my parents will never let me just bring somebody around the house. So I really took all of that and was like, okay, this is who I am and this is my truth. And so they also encouraged me to have like friends in the community. But I didn't actually really live next to like my community. I got access to the internet way later than most of my peers. And I just feel like while other kids in my community got to see each other grow up because they went to school together and they kind of saw themselves go through self journeys of discovery and making mistakes. For me, I felt like I constantly only had this like perfect picture of life in my head. And so years and years later, when I got older and I lived by myself, And it was just me, no family, no nothing. I really took a lot of that forced vulnerability that I've been like building up and that sense of self that I built based on this idealized version of who I should be because of how I present myself and my persona in person. Like this beautiful, stereotypical Muslim Somali girl who's amazing and cool and perfect. I felt like I really had that self-help version of vulnerability of I was out there doing all these vulnerable things, but due to those like circumstances I created, this whole like version of myself, that double consciousness that like WD's boys talked about, as well as like the research articles talked about, as well as like even when I went to college, I lived at home. I still had that circle. Here's a couple hours of me being out, the identity I built, and being vulnerable by force, and then coming home and decompressing and being me. So think about all those things before I moved out once again. I felt like it was hard for me to make long-term friends. Like, I didn't know how to be vulnerable in any way. I felt like I still had to uphold those identities and I could easily check out. And so even though I kind of checked the box of like I was vulnerable in person and I will tell you about my life and I don't care in person. I couldn't move past like just casual friendships. So then I moved by myself, grad school, and I think that was the first time that it was like physically impossible for me to be constantly like double conscious and have those two versions of myself. And I also went to a place with a lot more white people. So I felt like this identity I created in the spaces I had before in Black communities was still me. And it wasn't necessarily that I had to like uphold this entire persona. It was me. It was just I was a little more reserved. And I was cool with like stepping up to the plate. I could criticize things around me and know that criticizing my culture is not criticizing me because we all did it. It was very multicultural. Or it was just a Black community who didn't really care about like the nuances of, oh, I met you, you represent your whole culture. And so I didn't feel like defending myself or talking about my culture felt like I was fighting a system, or I wouldn't be taken as the truth when talking about my own life. And when I went to these like white spaces or grad school or things outside of that as well, it was different. It was like when I stand up for myself, I wasn't believed in the same ways I did traditionally in like those Black spaces and multicultural spaces. And it really threw me off. Like, I was practicing the same forced vulnerability that I was doing as younger, but like the consequences were there. And all those like so-called benefits like the self-help books talk about being confident, loving yourself, and things that come out of like being vulnerable, those things like disappeared so quickly because like the environment wasn't welcoming to vulnerability. And I will like say that kind of shifted me to have like a third identity, like my white space identity. The way I'm speaking right now is my white space identity, free me. Which I didn't really have in the past, like, but I have had this be probably like the main identity I go about in life for the past 3 years. And so when I created this third identity, like that triple consciousness, I guess, I kind of realized, like, looking back and pausing, that, oh my God, I had self identities. I had two different ones at that. And I definitely carried myself differently and publicly than I did at home. And the burden of this new identity was so hard that I was like, oh, it's legitimately a new face. It's not like a mixing of my personalities or like the claim of, oh, I'm just reserved in public, but I'm like really cool and fun to get to know. So I realized that I had to reevaluate. I had to stop trying to be that perfect person and realizing, like, the shitty parts of myself are me too. I really had to be like, okay, what does it actually mean to be vulnerable and actually make real friendships? That was a hard thing to do, and it takes a lot of self realization to do that. So if you're like thinking about this and you're like, okay, like I get it, I'm just like you, we'll talk a little bit more about solutions, but just want to acknowledge it's not an easy thing to do, and honestly, it's pretty shocking. So now we're going to kind of shift to like the last part of what's happening now after I graduated and have been working for a year. And then what are some of the solutions for someone who might be going through this, who might not be going through like hard times, and how to process through it. And once again, like this next part is just me and my perspective, so it could be complete bullshit, but like I just want to like share the ways I have rationalized my understanding of where I am. So grad school was just 2 years of like really having to try to balance that mixing of having to balance having now kind of like 3 spaces myself, the perfectionist face that I used for a very long time, and then lastly like that white space face, which is like a heavy loaded version of my perfectionism. And I think because I had to deal with those things and had to like constantly be in spaces that was a lot more vulnerable with people than I've ever been in my life, I was actually able to like create long lasting friendships, or at least try to have friendships that last longer than hi and bye as soon as school finishes. And I hate to say this, but like when I started having my hardship, which was in the beginning of this year, towards the end of this year, so it's really about like a couple months after graduating. With so many like changes in my life at that, like I'm 25 at this point, but I was going into the workforce for the first time. I was having family problems. I had relatives die within my lifetime. It was just so much happening, and it's literally a story. And I hope eventually I'll have like the vulnerability or the bravery to share a lot more of it. But I'll say from that, like I was actually able to enjoy some of my friendships than I ever did in the past. I was able to be vulnerable. I was able to talk about things and also be a person for people. I think before I was a bit colder of seeing people be vulnerable with me because I was like, girl, how dare you get to be vulnerable and I can't be vulnerable. And as I went through these hard times and kind of opened up to people that I felt like were safe spaces for me, especially given the fact that like we're not being held together because we go to school together. We're not being held together because we're from the same community or we go to the same stores. Like each one of my friends at this time and then were friends that I decided value and mean to me, and I'm gonna go find them and talk to them. And so it was just a beautiful thing, and I've made like friendships, even friendships I had longer than that, deeper than I've ever did in my life. And I really appreciate that like vulnerability that I could have with those select people. So I kind of want to give some key points and solutions. They're not necessarily solutions, but like kind of pieces of advice that I've learned through this journey. One, if you're a perfectionist, high grades, studious, listen to your parents, you don't talk to guys because you're a good Muslim, etc., right? I really encourage you to stop and think for a second about your identities and how you identify yourself, and then think about, if I didn't have any of these things today, if all of these things came crashing down, you dropped out of school, your parents divorced or died or something, right? Who would you be? That person that you are in private? And then think about, as well as, of course, I'm not going to say that that whole thing that you did of going to school or doing those things isn't important. Instead, what I'm saying is you are more than the things around you and your accomplishments. And I really want you to think about those two identities, the one you might be putting front facing and the one that you might keep to yourself and are like very, oh my God, people are going to hate me. And try to think about the ways you can bridge it. I'm not saying combine it. I'm not saying in every situation you have to be who you are at home. Like I said, if you're a person of color, if you're Muslim, if you're just anything that you could be really put into forced vulnerability, it's not the space, and not every space will be that space for you to be vulnerable. However, you can find people to be vulnerable with. And that kind of brings me to my second point. You can make mistakes, you can be a shitty friend, and people can still be around you. If you're anything like me or what I was like, I know you're like right now, girl, shut up. Like, you know that. You see all of that, but I know like if I confront this person in the way they're treating me, it's gonna end a friendship. Or maybe how I used to react towards the later part of my life, saying that, I was being people pleasing, and now my friendship is set up that I can't address this person because of the way I built this friendship. Well, I'm gonna tell you, like, they're not gonna react the way you want them to react because we're all human beings. They might react amazingly, they might react negatively. You might, in your head, like I used to be like, it's easier to just cut this friendship off than continue. But I'll say, like, you're so used to being vulnerable sometimes that you push away any vulnerability that you didn't choose because you already have so much vulnerability in your life. But I'll say, look, if this person leaves you or you have that discussion with that person, like, if they are meant to be around you, like, putting religion in here, it's the qadar of Allah. If they are not meant to be around you, it's the qadar of Allah again. Like, whatever is written for you is written for you. And I'll say it gets easier. You probably will feel like shit, but like, it gets easier just knowing what the decision is one way or another. You don't have to think about it, because all I used to do was think about it. This next point, third point, I kind of already said a little bit, but as you move in these spaces, like the workforce, and especially non-work settings, especially when these places are majority the opposite of what you are, whether that's being a person of color or just you are maybe not the norm, the energy you put into something doesn't work the same way you did when it's in school. When you're in school, people were temporary. Like, it was, I sat next to you for one semester, or we were next to each other for 4 years. The identity you wear, it's not for a long time. You always know there's an end in near. When you get into the workforce, anywhere you are, you're expecting to stay there for a long time. I hope you're not going to be like, I'm leaving every work every 2 years, every 1 year. But keeping up that double consciousness, or your triple if you're like me, is so exhausting because you're constantly putting up a persona and you don't have places to be vulnerable because you never created vulnerability or long-term relationships with people around you that you can decompress. Especially, it's like, you go to work for 40 hours, then you call your friend up and you feel like you have to speak a certain way to her or him, or you have to vibe or blend in and be happy at an event that you don't even want to go to. So I really say, like, it's so much more enjoyable if you have like a job and you are able to decompress, de-stress, talk about dumb shit with friends that actually care about you, or you actually care about them too. That's the other thing. Sometimes you don't care about the people you're around because you never were vulnerable and you don't have like stakes or skin in the game. Okay. And the last part of my advice is, when you're going through hardship, it won't be easy if you're always self-regulating yourself. Oh my God. I forgot I wrote that. And I'll be honest, amazing. You are going to be bombarded with thousands of different things that you can't predict. You're going to be even more vulnerable than you already are. And I say that because you think you're vulnerable, but you can be even more vulnerable. And people can know more things about you that you never wanted people to realize. Or, you could be just put in situations that you aren't comfortable with 24/7. And you really feel like, at least for me, in the beginning, you can't really tell people about your lives and these struggles you're going through. You constantly feel like you're oversharing, or you feel so alone, even if you tell people the oversharing, because you didn't build that rapport, that vulnerability with that person. Yes, sometimes talking about your issue doesn't solve the problem. But I know when you're supported, it makes it a whole lot easier for you to be able to go through these things, as well as being able to actually decompress. Because for me, at least, it was so hard to understand and decompress some of these things because I was so scared to talk about the things that were happening in the beginning. Or even the way, and I still do this to this day and I'm working on it, but even the way you talk about sometimes these hardships or struggle is you kind of like detach from it. And you're like, this X, Y, and Z happened in my life. And you don't like think about your actual feelings and things like that. So just be mindful of like when you're vulnerable with people who matter, people who care, like you will feel so much better when you talk about these different things. And I'm not saying every single time it's going to be like amazing telling your friends all the horrible shit that's happening to you, but sometimes it just makes it easier and it makes you be able to handle some of like the hardship with ease. Shout out to the podcast name. So, what those 4 hard truths or pieces of advice. I can't tell you something magical to write on paper that will make you be able to not force yourself into that perfect self-image or force yourself into vulnerability. I'm not going to tell you to stand up in front of a classroom and say, these are my fun facts to make you feel vulnerable. And you can honestly brush off everything I'm saying because I know I did that for a long time. But I will say, just take a second, either to say it out loud, to a voice note, write it on paper. If you're scared of people finding these things, just remember, like, you can burn it, you can delete it, etc. Like, all of the reasons why someone wouldn't appreciate you as a person versus their self-image of you. Think about it. If you were to tell someone within your life some of these things, you don't have to tell the whole list. Even if it's just like one thing, how much of your life would change? It was so hard for me to be able to admit to people in my life that I'm a people pleaser, for example. But honestly, after I told some of my friends, I'm not gonna lie, it doesn't have a lot of power on me anymore. That I'm willing to say things in this first episode of a podcast that I was ever scared to even tell my friends. And I would tend to agree to things even if I don't like them, just so I wouldn't have to be vulnerable and have to explain myself, because I do that every single day in everything I do. So do I say that vulnerability is a privilege? Yes. Many of us are living in survival mode. I know I was for a very long time. And you might not currently have the opportunity to find someone to be vulnerable with. I've been vulnerable with people in my past, not in amazing ways. And sometimes it has went terrible. But I will say, like, the first step at least is trying to be vulnerable with yourself and acknowledging that you have like those different faces of your consciousness, acknowledging that you put on a facade to be able to get through your day. Trying each day, even if it's with a new friend that you're trying to be friends with or someone you've been in their life for a long time, to be a little bit more vulnerable about a mistake you made or something shitty that you think in life. And even if they call you out for like having a shitty thought, at the end of the day, you're calling yourself out more about that shitty thought for hours than they would in 10 seconds. Vulnerability is a privilege, but being vulnerable with the people around you is a blessing to them and you as well. It's a privilege because you're not able to see that vulnerability in other people's a lot of times as well. When I started being vulnerable, I got to see some beautiful parts of people I've never realized had those parts, whether how they care for me or even the times they're vulnerable with me and seeing all of their insecurities. And it really taught me that I didn't have to constantly bottle those things up. I can still be trying to be a perfectionist, as I always will be, but I also can be vulnerable with those around me that value and love me. And I will also say this to the Muslim girlies who are thinking about marriage and all those little cute things. If you can't be vulnerable with your friends around you, who are girls you have grown up with or girls that you've hung around, what makes you think that you can be vulnerable with a man? Just saying. And that's my little two piece. That's my little two piece of the week. And so Thank you guys so much for listening to my first podcast. Like, I was so scared. I still am scared saying all of this to be vulnerable. And I've refused to talk about, like, I really didn't tell you guys a lot of things that happened in my life. I keep being very big about hardship, but I really think this podcast and this first chance and first episode was one of my first places to actually be vulnerable. And as we talk more and more about hardship and some of the hardships I've been going through, I hope I can continue to be vulnerable in the ways that make me happy. And sometimes I won't be with the podcast, it might be with people in my real life, but excited to see where it goes. And it's a really hard topic, and I'm not expecting you to like jump up and be like, yeah, now I know I'm going to be vulnerable to everyone, because it took me like half of my life to actually be able to do this. Anyway, thank you guys for listening to Hardship with Ease with me, Jamila. Love you guys, appreciate you guys, and it's okay to be a bit of a loser, because I am, and I love y'all.